What if I told you that Henry VIII invented a torture device so horrifying that it made victims beg for the rack instead? Meet the Scavenger's daughter, a contraption designed to compress the human body until blood poured from every opening in your face. While most people know Henry VIII as the king who had 6 wives, they don't teach you in history class that he was also responsible for creating one of the most sadistic torture devices ever conceived. Picture this. You're accused of treason or speaking against the king's religious reforms. Instead of being stretched apart on the rack, you're forced into a metal frame that slowly crushes your body inward. Your knees are pressed against your chest, your arms folded tight against your sides, and with each turn of the screw, your ribs begin to crack. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The device was specifically designed so that your compressed organs would force blood up through your nose, mouth, and ears. The Scavenger's daughter wasn't just some medieval relic gathering dust in a castle somewhere. This was actively used during Henry's reign in the Tower of London, where prisoners accused of religious dissent and political opposition faced this nightmare fuel regularly. We're talking about real people who were subjected to compression so intense that their bodies literally couldn't contain the pressure. Think the rack was bad? The rack stretched you apart, which at least had the mercy of potentially killing you relatively quickly. The Scavenger's daughter did the exact opposite. It compressed you so tightly that death took much longer to arrive. Your own ribcage became a weapon against your internal organs, while your compressed lungs struggled to draw even the smallest breath. Victims described feeling like their bones were being ground to powder from the inside out. But wait, it gets worse. This wasn't some random torture device that happened to exist during Henry's time. Historical records show it was specifically commissioned during his reign, reflecting the king's particular obsession with controlling every aspect of his subjects' lives, including their religious beliefs. When Henry broke from Rome and established himself as head of the Church of England, anyone who dared question his religious authority could find themselves compressed in this metal nightmare. The most disturbing part? Palace records from the Tower of London document guards describing how victims would plead to be put on the rack instead. Imagine a torture device so brutal that people literally begged for a different form of torture. These prisoners knew exactly what both devices did, and they consistently chose being stretched apart over being crushed together. Here's something that will haunt your dreams. The device got its name from its inventor, Leonard Skeffington, who served as Lieutenant of the Tower of London. Skeffington was known as the Scavenger because of his role in cleaning up Henry's political problems. When someone needed to disappear or confess to crimes against the crown, they called the Scavenger. And his daughter device became the perfect tool for extracting confessions from those who dared oppose Henry's religious revolution. We're not just talking about a few isolated cases here. During the height of Henry's religious persecution, this device was used regularly on Catholics who refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church, Protestant reformers who pushed too far too fast, and political prisoners who threatened royal authority. The Tower of London's torture chambers echoed with the sounds of metal screws tightening and bones cracking as Henry's regime systematically crushed opposition both literally and figuratively. Picture this. You're a blacksmith in Tudor England, and you've just received the most disturbing commission of your career. The Tower of London needs a new torture device, but here's the twist. They don't want something that stretches people apart like the notorious rack. No, they want the exact opposite. They want something that crushes human beings inward until their own bodies become their prison. Meet Leonard Skeffington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London under Henry VIII, the man twisted enough to dream up this mechanical nightmare. Around 1530, while most people were worried about putting food on their tables, Skeffington was busy designing what would become known as the Scavenger's daughter, a torture device so brutal that it made the rack look merciful by comparison. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Skeffington didn't just wake up one morning and decide to invent a torture device for fun. He was responding to a very specific problem the Tudor regime was facing. The rack was excellent at pulling confessions out of people by stretching their bodies to the breaking point, but some prisoners were finding ways to endure it. The human body, it turns out, can sometimes adapt to being pulled apart. So the sick minds running Henry's torture chambers asked themselves a chilling question. What if we tried the opposite? The political climate of Henry's reign was a perfect storm for this kind of innovation in human suffering. This was a king who had just declared himself head of the English Church, breaking away from Rome and creating enemies everywhere. Catholics who refused to accept his authority, Protestants who thought he wasn't going far enough, nobles plotting against him. Henry was quite literally surrounded by people he considered traitors. And in Tudor England, treason wasn't just a crime. It was a disease that needed to be cut out with surgical precision. What made Skeffington's invention particularly diabolical was its mathematical precision. Where medieval torture often relied on crude brutality, the Scavenger's daughter was engineered suffering. The device forced the human body into positions that nature never intended, compressing the victim so tightly that their own ribcage became a weapon against their internal organs. The timing wasn't coincidental either. The 1530s were when Henry's paranoia reached fever pitch. This was the decade when he executed Thomas More, when he dissolved the monastery. When anyone who dared question his authority found themselves facing charges of high treason. The Tower of London was working overtime, and Skeffington needed tools that could extract confessions faster and more efficiently than ever before. But here's the most chilling part about its origins. The Scavenger's daughter wasn't created by some sadistic madman operating in shadows. This was an official government innovation, designed by the lieutenant of the Tower himself, a man who held one of the most respected positions in the realm. Skeffington wasn't some rogue torturer. He was a civil servant doing his job with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that makes institutional cruelty so much more terrifying than random violence. The device got its name from Skeffington's own nickname. He was called the Scavenger for his ability to clean up Henry's political messes by extracting confessions from inconvenient prisoners. In a regime where loyalty could shift overnight and today's trusted advisor could become tomorrow's traitor, having a reputation as someone who could make people talk wasn't just useful, it was essential for survival in Henry's court of paranoia and blood. Henry VIII didn't just break from Rome to marry Anne Boleyn. He shattered centuries of religious tradition and plunged England into a nightmare of political terror that would make Stalin's purges look restrained. We're talking about a king who executed an estimated 72,000 people during his 38-year reign. That's nearly 5 people every single day, including weekends and holidays. But here's what your history textbooks won't tell you. Henry didn't maintain power through charm or political genius. He ruled through systematic terror, and he needed tools that could break both bodies and souls. The rack could stretch you until your joints popped like firecrackers, sure, but what if Henry wanted the opposite? What if he wanted to crush the defiance out of someone by literally crushing their entire body? Picture this. You're a Catholic priest in 1534, and you've just refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the English Church. Maybe you're Thomas More, once Henry's trusted advisor, now rotting in the Tower of London. Or perhaps you're just an ordinary monk who won't surrender your monastery's lands to the crown. Either way, you've committed the ultimate sin in Tudor England. You've said no to the king. Henry's break with Rome wasn't just about divorce. It was about absolute power, and absolute power requires absolute fear. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry didn't just find another wife. He declared war on 1,500 years of Christian tradition. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. But here's the terrifying part. Anyone who refused to swear the oath acknowledging this could be charged with high treason, and treason meant death. But death wasn't enough for Henry. He needed confessions. He needed public submissions. He needed to show every person in England what happened when you defied the crown. Traditional methods of persuasion weren't cutting it anymore. The political stakes were too high, the religious revolution too fragile. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, understood that fear was the only currency that mattered. Cromwell had spent years watching European politics, studying how other monarchs maintained control. He knew that successful tyranny required innovation, and innovation meant creating new ways to break human beings. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 showed Henry just how precarious his position really was. 40,000 rebels marched against his religious reforms, demanding a return to Catholic traditions. Henry crushed the rebellion, but not before realizing that gentle persuasion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed methods that could extract confessions from the most stubborn prisoners, tools that could make even the most devoted religious martyrs beg for mercy. This is where traditional torture fell short. The rack stretched victims horizontally, but some prisoners could endure even that agony. What Henry needed was something that attacked the human body differently, something that compressed and crushed rather than stretched and pulled. He needed a device that could make blood pour from a victim's eyes and nose, that could force the body to turn against itself. Enter Leonard Skeffington, Henry's lieutenant of the Tower of London. Skeffington understood that sometimes the most effective torture wasn't about inflicting maximum pain. It was about inflicting the right kind of pain, the kind that made resistance impossible. And in the depths of the Tower of London, he was about to create a device that would become synonymous with Tudor terror. Picture this. You're chained into a metal hoop barely 3 feet wide, forced into a crouching position like you're hugging your own knees. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. This isn't just uncomfortable positioning. The Scavenger's daughter was designed to do something far more sinister than the rack ever could. While the rack pulled your body apart, this device compressed everything inward until your own skeleton became your worst enemy. The mechanism was brutally simple, which made it absolutely terrifying. You'd be forced into an A-shaped iron frame, your knees drawn up to your chest, arms wrapped around your legs, head pushed down toward your knees. Then the torture master would begin tightening the metal bands. With each turn of the screw, the iron hoop compressed smaller and smaller, forcing your body into an increasingly impossible position. Your ribs would start pressing against your internal organs first. We're talking about the kind of pressure that makes breathing feel like drowning on dry land. But wait, it gets worse. As the compression continued, your spine would curve beyond any natural limit. Imagine your backbone bending so far that vertebrae started grinding against each other, sending shooting pains through every nerve ending in your body. Here's what made this torture particularly dreadful. It used your own body weight against you. Unlike other devices that required external force, the Scavenger's daughter turned gravity into an accomplice. The longer you remained in position, the more your compressed organs would swell. Your lungs couldn't expand properly, so every breath became a desperate gasp. Your heart struggled to pump blood through compressed arteries. But the most horrifying part was what happened to your blood. As the pressure built up inside your compressed torso, blood would literally be forced upward through your body. Victims would start bleeding from their nose, mouth, and ears. Not from external wounds, but from the sheer internal pressure. Contemporary accounts describe blood pouring from faces like crimson tears, a sight so disturbing that even hardened tower guards would look away. The psychological torture was just as brutal as the physical agony. You could see exactly what was happening to your body. Unlike being stretched on a rack where you might lose consciousness from pain, the Scavenger's daughter kept you horribly aware. You'd watch your own blood dripping onto the tower floor, knowing that each drop meant the pressure inside you was building to unbearable levels. Modern medical experts believe the device could cause internal bleeding, organ damage, and permanent spinal compression in a matter of hours. We're talking about torture that could leave survivors permanently disabled, their bodies literally reshaped by the metal embrace of Tudor justice. What made this device particularly effective for Henry's interrogators was its precision. They could control exactly how much pressure to apply, keeping victims conscious and responsive while inflicting maximum agony. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was engineered to break human will while keeping the body functional enough to extract confessions, rites, or religious recantations. The Scavenger's daughter represented the perfect marriage of medieval brutality and Renaissance innovation. It was torture refined into a science, pain calibrated to break spirits while preserving just enough physical function to serve Henry's political needs. In a reign defined by paranoia and religious upheaval, this device became the ultimate tool for extracting truth, or at least whatever version of truth the Crown needed to hear. The Tower of London's records tell us exactly who felt the crushing grip of the Scavenger's daughter, and their stories will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Tudor justice. We're not talking about nameless criminals here. We're talking about priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was thinking differently than Henry VIII. Let's start with Father Thomas Cottam, a Jesuit priest arrested in 1580. Palace records describe how guards strapped him into the device, while interrogators demanded he reveal the locations of other Catholic priests hiding in England. Cottam's own letters, smuggled out of the tower, describe the sensation as feeling my very soul being pressed from my body. Within minutes, witnesses reported blood streaming from his nose and mouth as his rib cage compressed inward. But here's the truly horrifying part. They kept him conscious through it all, demanding answers between his s's. Then there's the case of Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer who dared to question Catholic doctrine during Henry's brief return to traditional beliefs. Court documents reveal she was tortured twice on the Scavenger's daughter in 1546. The first session lasted 2 hours. Guards had to carry her back to her cell because her legs could no longer support her compressed spine. But wait, it gets worse. When she still refused to recant her beliefs, they brought her back 3 days later. This time, the pressure was so intense that observers reported hearing her joints pop and crack as her body folded inward like a closing book. What makes these accounts even more chilling is how methodical the process was. Tower records show that sessions were carefully timed and documented. Guards would note exactly when victims began bleeding from their faces, when they lost consciousness, and when they finally broke. We're talking about a systematic approach to human destruction that would make modern interrogators sick. Consider the case of Edmund Campion, another Jesuit priest tortured in 1581. Eyewitness accounts from his trial describe how the Scavenger's daughter left him so physically damaged that he couldn't lift his arms to take the oath in court. His fingers were permanently curled inward, his spine curved from compression, and he spoke in barely a whisper because the device had crushed his chest cavity. Yet even in this condition, he maintained his innocence until his execution. But here's where it gets truly insane. Sometimes the device didn't even need to inflict maximum damage to work. Thomas Sherwood, arrested for harboring Catholic priests, broke after just 15 minutes in the Scavenger's daughter. Not because of the physical pain, though that was excruciating, but because of the psychological terror of feeling his body systematically compressed while knowing it could continue for hours. The most disturbing detail from Tower records: guards kept detailed notes on which victims lasted longest before breaking. They were literally perfecting their torture techniques, learning exactly how much pressure the human body could withstand before the mind snapped. Father Alexander Bryant lasted 4 separate sessions. Robert Johnson managed 6 hours total before revealing the names of Protestant sympathizers in court. These weren't isolated incidents or desperate last resorts. Between 1540 and 1580, Tower records document at least 46 confirmed uses of the Scavenger's daughter. 46 human beings compressed until blood poured from their faces, all in the name of religious and political conformity. And those are just the cases we know about. Historians believe the actual number could be 3 times higher. The victims' own words, preserved in court records and smuggled letters, paint a picture of suffering so intense that many prayed for death rather than face another session with Skeffington's grotesque invention. The Scavenger's daughter wasn't just a torture device. It became the physical embodiment of Henry VIII's war against religious conscience. When the king broke from Rome in 1534, he didn't just change England's official religion. He unleashed a reign of terror against anyone who dared question his spiritual authority. Picture this. You're a Catholic who refuses to acknowledge Henry as head of the English Church. Or maybe you're a Protestant radical who thinks his reforms don't go far enough. Either way, you're now an enemy of the state. And that cold iron contraption waiting in the Tower of London, that's your punishment for the crime of believing differently than your king. The device became particularly synonymous with religious persecution because of who ended up compressed within its brutal embrace. Catholic priests who continued celebrating Latin Mass found themselves folded into human pretzels until blood streamed from their faces. Protestant reformers who criticized Henry's version of Christianity discovered that their theological debates would be settled not with scripture, but with crushing metal. Here's what made this persecution so insidious. Henry used the Scavenger's daughter strategically. The goal wasn't always to kill immediately. Sometimes victims were compressed just enough to break their will, then released to spread word of what awaited religious dissenters. Imagine trying to maintain your faith, knowing that questioning the king's religious authority could literally reshape your skeleton. The psychological impact extended far beyond the tower's walls. Parish priests across England knew that one wrong sermon, one slip of theological disagreement, could land them in Skeffington's invention. Church attendance became an exercise in careful neutrality. Say too little about supporting Henry's reforms, and you might be labeled a secret Catholic. Show too much enthusiasm for further Protestant changes, and you could be branded a dangerous radical. But wait, it gets worse. The device didn't just terrorize individual believers. It systematically dismantled England's religious communities. Catholic monasteries, knowing their members faced potential torture for maintaining papal loyalty, often surrendered without resistance. Protestant congregations self-censored their theological discussions, afraid that someone might report their conversations to royal authorities. The wider impact on religious movements was devastating. Underground Catholic networks had to operate knowing that capture meant not just death, but prolonged agony in the Scavenger's daughter first. Protestant reformers found themselves caught in an impossible position, supporting a king who persecuted Catholics while simultaneously crushing Protestant voices that went too far. What's truly horrifying is how the mere existence of this device changed the nature of religious discourse in England. Theological debates that had once been passionate intellectual exchanges became whispered conversations in hidden corners. Faith, something meant to be proclaimed openly, became a dangerous secret that could literally compress your body until your ribs cracked. The Scavenger's daughter represented something darker than individual cruelty. It embodied state-sponsored religious terrorism. Henry VIII had created a tool that made believing the wrong thing not just illegal, but physically unbearable. The device sent a clear message. Your conscience belongs to the crown, and defying royal religious authority will result in your body being systematically destroyed. By the time Henry's reign ended, England's religious landscape had been permanently transformed. Not through theological persuasion or spiritual awakening, but through the simple terror of knowing that religious dissent could end with your body being compressed until blood poured from your face. The Scavenger's daughter had succeeded in making faith itself a form of treason. The Scavenger's daughter didn't just disappear when Henry VIII died. Its legacy carved itself into the very foundation of how we understand power and control in human history. This wasn't merely a torture device that gathered dust in some Tower of London cellar. It became a symbol of something far more chilling, the lengths to which those in power will go to maintain their grip over the minds and souls of their subjects. Here's what makes this device so historically significant. It represents the moment when torture became scientific. The medieval period had its brutal methods, sure, but the Scavenger's daughter represented something coldly calculated. Someone sat down, studied the human body, and engineered a machine specifically designed to break people without killing them too quickly. We're talking about systematic psychological warfare disguised as justice. The device's true horror lies not in its physical mechanics, but in what it reveals about Tudor society. Every time that iron contraption was wheeled into a cell, it sent a message that rippled through every corner of the kingdom. Religious dissent? Compression until you recant. Political opposition? We'll squeeze the rebellion right out of you. The Scavenger's daughter wasn't just torturing individuals, it was terrorizing an entire population into submission. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't the work of some deranged tyrant operating in isolation. The use of the Scavenger's daughter required systematic approval from multiple levels of government. Court officials had to authorize its use, guards had to operate it, physicians had to monitor victims to ensure they survived long enough to talk. We're looking at institutionalized brutality that required dozens of people to simply look the other way while their fellow human beings were systematically destroyed. The psychological impact extended far beyond the tower's walls. Imagine knowing that expressing the wrong religious opinion or criticizing the king's policies could land you in that device. Picture how that fear shaped every conversation, every letter, every prayer. The Scavenger's daughter didn't just compress bodies, it compressed the entire intellectual and spiritual freedom of a nation. Modern historians argue that devices like the Scavenger's daughter marked a turning point in how governments controlled their populations. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was bureaucratized terror, complete with documentation, procedures, and systematic implementation. Sound familiar? The techniques pioneered in Tudor torture chambers would echo through centuries of authoritarian control. The most chilling aspect of its legacy is how effectively it worked. Henry VIII successfully crushed religious opposition, eliminated political rivals, and maintained absolute control over his kingdom. The Scavenger's daughter proved that systematic terror could indeed preserve power, a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten by future tyrants. Yet its legacy also includes something the torturers never intended. It became evidence of human resilience. Many of those compressed within its iron embrace never broke. They chose excruciating physical destruction over surrendering their beliefs. Their courage, preserved in historical records, stands as testimony that the human spirit can withstand even the most scientifically designed brutality. The Scavenger's daughter reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty isn't some distant medieval barbarism. It's a recurring feature of human civilization. Every time we see governments using fear to control populations, every time we witness systematic terror disguised as justice, we're seeing the same impulses that created that compression device over 400 years ago. The machine may be silent now, but its lessons about power, fear, and human endurance continue to haunt us. The Scavenger's daughter stands as perhaps the most chilling testament to humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. This wasn't just a torture device, it was a deliberate perversion of human engineering, designed specifically to exploit every weakness in the human body's structure. While the rack pulled people apart, the Scavenger's daughter compressed them into a living nightmare, forcing victims to watch their own bodies betray them as blood poured from their faces and their bones screamed under the pressure. What makes this device particularly haunting isn't just its brutality, but what it represents about the society that created it. Henry VIII's England wasn't some barbaric frontier civilization. This was a sophisticated, educated court that produced magnificent art, literature, and architecture. Yet the same minds that could appreciate beauty and culture could also conceive of tortures so systematic and cruel that they seem almost industrial in their efficiency. The Scavenger's daughter reveals something disturbing about power itself. It wasn't enough for Henry VIII to simply execute those who opposed him. He needed them to suffer first, to be broken not just physically but psychologically. The device represents the ultimate expression of state control, the ability to reduce any human being, regardless of their station or beliefs, to nothing more than a collection of bones and blood being systematically compressed. Think about the people who operated this machine. They weren't monsters from fairy tales. They were ordinary men with families who went home each night after spending their days slowly crushing other human beings. They had to look into the eyes of scholars, priests, and political prisoners as they turned the screws tighter. The bureaucracy of torture required dozens of people to participate, from the guards who brought victims to the tower, to the officials who recorded their confessions, to the craftsmen who maintained the device itself. The religious persecution aspect makes it even more chilling. People died in agony simply for believing differently about scripture or challenging the king's authority over their souls. The Scavenger's daughter became a tool for enforcing not just political loyalty, but spiritual submission. It represents the terrifying moment when state power reaches into the most intimate corners of human consciousness, our relationship with the divine. What's most disturbing is how easily this happened. Henry VIII didn't seize power in a violent coup. He inherited it legally and maintained popular support throughout his reign. The torture chambers of the Tower of London operated with full government approval, documented in official records, funded by public taxes. This wasn't the work of a few sadistic individuals, but an entire system that normalized extreme cruelty as necessary for maintaining order. The Scavenger's daughter forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The capacity for systematic cruelty doesn't belong to some distant, primitive past. It emerges from the same human nature that creates art, builds families, and dreams of better futures. The officials who used this device weren't aliens. They were people who convinced themselves that crushing human beings was not only acceptable but righteous. Today, when we hear about authoritarian regimes and human rights abuses, it's easy to imagine ourselves as naturally resistant to such horrors. But the Scavenger's daughter reminds us that ordinary people, given the right circumstances and justifications, can become complicit in unimaginable cruelty. The real lesson isn't that people in the past were more barbaric than we are. It's that the capacity for barbarism never truly disappears. The screams that once echoed through the Tower of London have been silent for centuries, but the questions they raise about power, cruelty, and human nature remain as relevant